Mr. Speaker. I agree with what my honourable friend from Macclesfield had to say, and indeed my honourable friend for Hammersmith and Fulham from the front bench, when they referred to the fantasy figures that, in a sense, undermined much of the budget that we had recently. The very prospect that there might be 3.5% growth in the year after next, of course, provided a very convenient alibi to the government to avoid making some of the very tough decisions that it now needs to be making on public expenditure. And those decisions have effectively now been delayed until after the next general election. My honourable friend rightly recalled the emergence of the IMF, as indeed did the right honourable gentleman for Hitchin and Harpenden in his speech. That obviously was some 33 years ago, and I think the big worry in many people's minds is that we will have to return down that path. And again, I suspect if that is to be the case, the government will do all it can to avoid it happening on its watch. Now, as the Member of Parliament for the City of London, I also believe there will be several very pressing issues that will emerge in the months ahead in our financial heartlands. As the Minister knows, 2 of the big 4 domestic banks are now all but fully nationalised. One of those, the Lloyds Banking Group, contains what might euphemistically be called assets from HBOS, which, of course, in recent years engaged in a series of balance sheet boosting debt for equity deals during the boom years in the middle of this decade. As a consequence, Lloyds Banking Group has large holdings in a swathe of leading UK companies. Doubtlessly, many such household names will require refinancing as the downturn proceeds. Such financial rescue will come from the taxpayers' coffers for obvious reasons, and in short, before long, considerably large parts of mainstream corporate UK could end up effectively being nationalised. I do think that we need to use some much smarter intelligence to nip the regulatory problems in the bud. An enhanced role for the Bank of England is very much part of my own party's policy, but I think that will also have to be accompanied by the appointment of some high-calibre, trusted and respected professionals into its top roles. I believe this should also be augmented by the emergence of prosecutors with the US-style status in place of what I'm afraid has been an increasingly discredited serious fraud office. Nothing less, in my view, will restore confidence both from market professionals but also from the public at large. Mr. Deputy Speaker, turning to some of the elements of the banking bailouts, I fear they will have, and indeed have already been proved to a large extent to be an expensive failure, and I don't entirely agree with the comments by my right honourable friend earlier on. The lesson I think we must learn is that any institution that is deemed to be too big to be allowed to fail will forever be prey to reckless risk-taking. If no bank can fail, then they cannot effectively be regulated because regulation requires the eradication rather than the reward of recklessness. Now, I can appreciate that in the economy we're in, it is difficult, certainly, for us to simply stand aside, not so much for the purposes of banks, but certainly in relation to depositors. But the operation of capitalism requires corporate failure. That's not market failure, as it's been articulated by many in the governing circles. It's a sign in many ways that capitalism is working properly and efficiently. Instead, but the message has been given that banks will not be allowed to fail only serves to make their effective regulation all but impossible, because regulation also creates tremendous barriers to entry and therefore gives advantage to larger corporations over smaller startups. The wisest policy option should surely be to create smaller, more competitive financial institutions, and I fear that the nationalisation that we have seen, and may yet see more of, leads us in precisely the wrong policy direction. The best form of regulation must always be open competition, and public ownership is an anathema to that policy goal. Of course.
Does the government create smaller financial institutions?
Well, I should come on to that in a moment or two, and I think one of the great mistakes that was made in the US, obviously, was the breaking down a decade ago of the Glass-Steagall distinction between investment banks and depositor banks. And one of the reasons, clearly, we have to, as I say, to protect depositor interests. One of the core problem we've now seen with the nationalisation of our banks is that actually the bondholders' interests have now also been preserved at the expense, effectively, of taxpayers, both present and future. I also want to touch on an area that my right honourable friend touched on earlier on, which was quantitative easing. I suspect that the current consensus that favours it will find less favour as this year wears on. with relatively little evidence that the velocity within the money, of money within the economy is any less sluggish as the real recession takes hold. Printing money in vast quantities increasingly seemed to me like a last throw of the governmental dice when relatively little else had succeeded. I think my honourable friend was quite right, my right honourable friend, when he said that inflation is not clearly an imminent problem, but I do think that this unprecedented pumping of money into the system is certain to be inflationary as time goes on. History suggests that an unsustained mini-boom may well be on the cards by the first half of next year, but also I fear that stagflation, which will be a toxic mix of inflation, rapidly rising unemployment, and low growth and diminished competitiveness will also follow. Indeed, the commodities and futures markets are already factoring this into the pricing in the early years of the next decade. And I suspect that the government will not have seen the last of its own recent problems that it experienced in trying to sell gilts. And there's also a lot of evidence in the city that many banks are now holding vast sums of cash ready to reinvest into the market, courtesy of the Bank of England's policy of promoting liquidity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this crisis, now that we are living in a globalised economy, is certainly very different, I accept, in magnitude than that we have ever seen before. One of the grand old names of British banking, Barings, collapsed owing what seems like a minuscule amount of £780 million only 14 years ago. Today, RBS survives courtesy only of a £26 billion bailout. But there are some lessons we can learn from the past. As I've mentioned earlier on, I do think we need to restore the distinction between retail and investment banking, which in the US at least existed for over 6 decades until the repeal of Glass-Steagall by the Clinton administration in 1999. The purposes of what was at that juncture regarded as a somewhat outdated 1930s throwback legislation is the protection of the ordinary depositor from high-risk, if innovative, banking practices. And that protection now seems mighty apposite. How then do we deal with the toxic assets that banks still hold and find so difficult to quantify? Now, curiously enough, it seems to me that the UK has a pretty good template close at hand. The near collapse of Lloyd's of London in the insurance market, which has gone to great strength in recent years, of course was avoided only 2 decades ago by the creation of a government-backed Equitas fund. This experience should, I think, be the starting point for consideration for any other large-scale government-backed rescue expenditure. And I think in some fairness to the government has begun down such a path, although I think we should also be fearful of what the overall cost is likely to be to the taxpayer. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the nagging sense, I think, of insecurity among the majority of the UK workforce that the spoils of globalisation are being spread inequitably will continue to grow, and it has, I think, the makings of some very serious social unrest. The hollowing out, and I would almost echo the words of the Honourable Gentleman for Macclesfield earlier on, the hollowing out of large-scale parts of what one might call traditional UK industry, particularly in manufacturing, as job employment has been exported to low-cost China and India, has not been accompanied by higher middle-class and middle-income professional earnings, at least for those who are outside the gilded worlds of the financial and associated services. Over the past decade, there has been a mirage of higher living standards being maintained only by a credit-fueled residential property market. The sharp correction that has taken place here has exposed the reality that actually international free trade has done little to enrich personally, at least, the majority of many of our fellow countrymen in recent times. And it's dawning on many middle-income folk that the losers from the free movement of labour and capital are not simply the unskilled who are forced to compete with ever larger numbers of migrant workers. It's also increasingly apparent that the generation about to join the workforce will probably be less well off than their parents, not least as they have to foot the bill for the economic unravelling that became so apparent from last September. Their phenomenon, in my view, is an almost unimaginable outside times of war. And it's a very shocking indictment for the whole generation of politicians around today. And looking at the political difficulties ahead, there's little doubt that for whichever political party wins the next general election, there will be some very tough and unpalatable decisions that will have to be made on public spending. Because even if the government's own, almost certainly wildly optimistic figures on public spending come to pass, during 2009 it would be raising only £3 for every £4 that it spends. And I think we really need to come to terms in double quick time with the fact that and I would again very much agree with what my right honourable friend said earlier on, there are entire areas of current central and local government activity that arguably should no longer qualify for public funding. The overall state of the public finances suggests that even in areas such as education, health and defence that will be discussed in the forthcoming debate, which in more economically clement times my party has pledged to ring-fence, further scrutiny will be necessary. And whilst there has been a marked improvement in school and hospital infrastructure over the past decade, much of this has of course been financed by the PFI, which will need to be paid off because it is off balance sheet, but it will need to be paid for in the years to come. I appreciate that the Honourable Lady for Northampton North, having arrived here slightly late, does want to say a few words. So I will bring my comments to an end if I may, but I might just say that I think that we have lived to a large extent in the best of times over the last decade or so economically, and now we really have got a very big price to pay, and a much, much tougher era awaits.